Kerrville, Texas, April 1859. As the first light of dawn touches the rolling hills, a quiet unease grips a gathering of settlers on the outskirts of town. This region, once dominated by ancient forests and winding rivers, has become home to a growing population of German immigrants and American pioneers, drawn by the land's rich soil and abundant game. Yet today, the settlers' focus is not on prosperity, but on a man who has disappeared without a trace. Roland Nichols, a respected local figure, is missing. Nichols, 54 years old, was no stranger to the hardships of frontier life. Born in Franklin County, Tennessee, in 1805, he had spent time in Arkansas before making his way to Texas in 1856, bringing his wife and children with him. He was known to be a determined man, committed to making a life on the land. Yet since the morning before, no friend or neighbor has seen him. His disappearance is all the more unsettling because his journey that day was meant to be routine, just a short excursion into the hills to hunt wild turkey. The landscape surrounding Kerrville is as breathtaking as it is deceptive. Towering oak trees stretch over rolling meadows, their roots gripping soil that has been nourished by generations of life. Rivers carve their way through the countryside, their cool waters whispering the stories of those who came before. For those new to the land, it is a paradise, an untouched wilderness teeming with opportunity. But the land holds its own truths, ones that settlers often refuse to acknowledge. To them, this place of San Antonio and Austin seems like a gift, an untamed Eden waiting to be claimed. Yet history tells a different story. This land was never empty, never free for the taking. Long before American settlers arrived, it had already been fought over in brutal conflicts, shaped by the struggles of those who had called it home for centuries. For generations, the Apache called this land home, moving across its rugged terrain, following the rhythms of the rivers and the migrations of the buffalo. But as history so often repeats itself, even those who had once controlled these lands would find themselves at the mercy of a greater force. This region of Texas became the epicenter of one of the most ruthless wars ever waged on American soil. It was not a battle for resources alone, nor was it a simple conflict over hunting grounds. It was a war of eradication, a calculated, relentless effort by the Comanche to eliminate the Apache from the land entirely. Few Spanish missions had managed to carve out a presence north of San Antonio, their fragile outposts standing as brief interruptions in a land already torn by war. Survivors of Comanche raids, Apache warriors, elders, women, and children, sought refuge behind the stone walls of these missions, pleading for protection from the relentless pursuit of their enemies. But the Spanish, their empire stretched thin, and their ambition for northern expansion dimming, were neither prepared nor willing to intervene in a war they could not control. For decades, Apache villages were burned, families torn apart, and entire bands driven into the wilderness. No one was spared. The young, the old, the strong, the weak. Each was subject to the merciless violence of the Comanche, who sought not just dominance, but the complete destruction of their rivals. The land itself bore witness to their relentless conquest. Every river that had once provided life now became a silent observer to battles fought on its banks. Every canyon that had once offered shelter became a trap where warriors made their last stand. Even the Spanish, with their steel weapons and well-fortified missions, could not hold their ground against the ferocity of Comanche raids. They had come seeking empire, but the reality of life on this frontier was more brutal than they had imagined. After failed attempts to expand northward, they abandoned their ambitions, retreating southward, leaving behind only ruins and echoes of a conquest that never was. By the 1850s, the Texas frontier had become a land of transformation, shaped by the arrival of settlers who came seeking new beginnings. German immigrants and pioneers from the southeastern states, Tennessee, Alabama, and Arkansas, pushed westward, drawn by the promise of fertile land and open skies. They were newcomers to this place, but the dangers they faced were the same ones that had haunted every generation before them. Out here, the full moon was not a symbol of beauty or wonder, it was a sign of danger. For decades, the Comanche had used the cover of night, moving swiftly under the moon's glow, striking settlements with precision and disappearing just as quickly. The settlers soon learned what those before them already knew. When the moon was high, the raids would come. Stories of these attacks spread like wildfire, filling the minds of those who had barely set foot on the land, reinforcing a fear that would shape their every action. Yet among them, some refused to be driven away. Roland Nichols was one such man. He had made his way from Tennessee to Arkansas, then to Texas in 1856, determined to stake his claim. The dangers, the whispered tales of Comanche brutality, the warnings from those who had seen settlements wiped from the earth, none of it shook his resolve. He was elected county commissioner, a position that made him a figure of trust and influence in Kerrville, a leader among those who had come to carve out a new life. But on the frontier, titles meant nothing when the land itself was still contested, when history had not yet chosen sides. Nichols may have believed he could tame this place, that his role in the community gave him security. But in a land where the past was written in blood and the future uncertain, conviction alone was never enough to guarantee survival. The frontier was a land of risk, but for those who had lived there long enough, danger was not an excuse for inaction. The threat of Comanche raids was ever present, yet the settlers could not afford to remain behind closed doors. Hunting, fishing, and tending livestock were not mere pastimes, they were essential for survival. Roland Nichols understood this well. He had heard the stories, knew the risks, yet on that fateful morning, the Texas countryside seemed too peaceful, too still, for danger to be lurking. Perhaps it was the crisp air or the quiet hum of the rolling hills, but Nichols saw the day as an opportunity. A mile from his home, just beyond the tree line, was prime hunting ground, a place where wild turkey roamed freely. He had made similar trips before, always returning with fresh game. He carried his double-barrel shotgun, a hunting knife, and a small supply pouch, enough to defend himself if needed, but not enough to suggest he expected trouble. There had been no reports of raids in the past few weeks. Why would this morning be any different? His family watched him leave, unaware that it would be the last time they would see him. Hours passed. The sun climbed high, then began its descent, painting the sky with deep streaks of amber and red. Still, Nichols had not returned. By dusk, concern turned to fear. His wife, sensing that something was wrong, reached out to their neighbors. The community responded quickly, gathering men to form a search party. But nightfall came too soon, forcing them to wait until morning. As they stood in the dimming light, weapons in hand, their silence said more than words ever could. No one wanted to voice what they all feared, that by the time they found their friend and neighbor, it would be too late. The men moved with purpose, weapons checked and ready, their senses sharp with anticipation. This was no ordinary search. They were not just looking for a missing man. They were stepping into uncertainty, into the shadow of the Comanche, where the line between hunter and hunted could shift in an instant. Eyes swept the ground, scanning for footprints, but they did not search blindly. They knew the land, its signs, its silent warnings. Every rustling branch, every distant movement, was another reason to keep their hands near their weapons. For a mile, Nichols' tracks followed the expected path. His boot-heeled prints led exactly where he had told his wife he would go, toward the mouth of the ravine, a familiar hunting ground. His trail was clear, undisturbed, giving the men a fleeting hope that perhaps they would find him safe, stranded by an injury or lost in the wilderness. But just as they neared the ravine's entrance, everything changed. There, imprinted in the earth, were tracks unlike Nichols's. Not deep and rigid like boots, but soft and rounded, the unmistakable mark of moccasins. More than one. The men stopped. The air, already thick with tension, grew heavier. The peaceful Texas countryside that Nichols had ventured into that morning no longer felt like a land of opportunity. It felt like a battlefield, and they had just crossed onto uncertain ground. They had been following him for miles, staying just out of sight, moving when he moved, stopping when he stopped. How many of them were there? The search party couldn't tell, but one thing was clear. Roland Nichols had been hunted, and he had known it. The moment of realization must have been sudden, a shift from uneasy caution to outright terror. His boot tracks, steady until now, veered sharply east, away from the ravine he had intended to reach. This was no longer the path of a hunter. It was the frantic flight of a man trying to escape. But Nichols wasn't alone. Soft, rounded moccasin prints trailed his every step, growing closer and closer. Then, the trail took an even stranger turn. At the base of a lone tree, something inexplicable had happened. From a distance, it looked as if some wild animal had stripped its bark in a perfect ring, circling the trunk about 5 feet off the ground. The men stopped, their breath heavy in the silent air. No animal could have done this, and when they followed the tracks, they saw the truth. Nichols had run in circles, looping around the tree again and again. His footprints doubled back over themselves, his path frantic, confused. He had clung to the trunk so tightly, so desperately, that his hands had peeled the bark away as he moved. He had tried to shake his pursuers, to throw them off, to make them lose sight of him just long enough to find a chance to fight or flee. But the other tracks never wavered. They had followed him with purpose, closing in step by step. At that tree, Nichols had made his last stand, and beyond it, the trail ran no further. The search party moved cautiously, eyes scanning the rugged landscape, their nerves frayed by the weight of what they might find. Then, just beyond the tree where Nichols had fought to escape, they saw him. He lay motionless in the grass, only yards from the place where his desperate struggle had left its mark. An arrow pierced his chest. Another had struck his abdomen, alongside a gunshot wound. It was clear Nichols had fought, had run, had tried to live. But in the end, the land had claimed him. The men studied the scene, piecing together his final moments. The first arrow, they believed, had driven into his chest, staggering him. The earth told the next part of the story, indentations in the dirt, the soft impression of knees. Nichols had fallen, maybe in shock, maybe still gripping his weapon, trying to return fire. But then came the next blow. The second arrow and a bullet, both striking nearly the same place, first ripping through his arm, then into his side. Wounded, dying, Nichols had made one last attempt to escape. He had risen to his feet, pushed himself forward, running until his body could take no more. Nearby, half buried in the dirt, lay his double-barrel shotgun, still fully loaded. He had never fired a shot. Had he lost his chance, or had the fight been over before he could even raise his weapon? No one would ever know. The men lifted his body and carried him home, back to Kerrville, back to the land he had claimed as his own. They laid him beneath the great oak, where he rests even now. The place where he fell, the ground where he fought for his life, those are forgotten. But the cemetery that bears his name remains, a quiet marker of a man who dared to settle a land that had never belonged to him. Another life lost in the relentless struggle for Texas, a tragedy, but not an uncommon one. Yet something about the death of Roland Nichols did not sit right. It wasn't just the way he died, but the details that didn't fit, the unanswered questions that lingered long after his body was carried home. No record exists of whether Nichols was scalped. If the Comanche had truly been responsible, why leave behind the most symbolic trophy of war? A warrior's triumph was often marked in blood, a life taken and a story told through the ritual of scalping. But if his body remained untouched beyond the fatal wounds, then this was not a typical raid. This was something else. And then there was the weapon. A shotgun, fully loaded, left half buried in the dirt. Comanche warriors did not waste such valuable spoils. A firearm was more than a tool. It was a prize, a status symbol, a weapon that could be turned against future enemies. Leaving it behind was not just unusual, it was unthinkable. Whispers began to spread in Kerrville. No formal accusations were made, but the townspeople talked. Perhaps Nichols had made the wrong enemies, not on the frontier, but within the town itself. As county commissioner, had he crossed someone who wanted him gone? Or was it about the land, 1,700 acres of Texas soil, land that could be carved up and sold if Nichols' widow had no choice but to part with it? The law meant little on the frontier, where survival belonged to those who knew how to wield power, whether with a gun, a blade, or a well-placed scheme. Here, danger did not come only from those seen as the enemy. It came from neighbors, business partners, and men who shook hands in daylight but plotted in the dark. Nichols's death may have been written off as another casualty of the untamed frontier, but the truth may never be known. Who killed Roland Nichols? Was it the work of his own people, scheming settlers with their own ambitions? Or was it the wrath of Comanche warriors, a response to yet another intruder, carving his name into land that was never his to claim? the truth will never be known. His grave remains, a silent marker beneath the sprawling oak tree he once loved. The land remembers him, but not the way he might have hoped. His story, like so many others, fades into the dust of the Texas frontier, swallowed by time, buried with the countless who came before and after. But Nichols' fate is only one thread in a much larger tapestry. The killings, the raids, the blood spilled between settlers and the first peoples of these lands, this story does not begin or end with one man. The frontier was no place for the weak, no sanctuary for those who sought peace. It was a battleground where every stake was paid for in blood, and where history was written by those who survived.